This is Cinchona, a tree whose legacy is as bitter as its taste. For over 3 centuries, its elusive bark was humanity's only defense in the fight against malaria. The disease alone is responsible for killing 5% of all the humans who've ever lived. The tree was a medical marvel, but it opened the door to a dark chapter in history. The story begins in the icy foothills of the Peruvian Andes. It's the 17th century, and Spanish Jesuits are here on a mission to spread the word of God. On passing a silver mine, the priests come across local pit workers chewing on the bark of the Cinchona tree. On questioning, the miners explained that they were taking it so as to calm their cold-induced shivers, as they were required to wade through an icy river on their daily commute to the mine. For the priests, shivering had long been a harbinger of doom. It was a telltale sign of malaria, which was a major problem in Europe at the time. It was a period in history when many cities were surrounded by marshland, an environment that provided an ideal breeding ground for malaria-spreading mosquitoes. Such was the disease's prevalence that many of the priests brought it with them when they travelled to the New World. They were on the lookout for anything that might ease their symptoms. Shivering from the cold and shivering from fever are not the same thing, but the Jesuits didn't know that, and as luck would have it, the bark was effective for treating their malarial shakes. It may well have been the first major discovery in medicine that was found to work for the wrong reasons. Soon the enthusiastic priest was sending crate loads of the bark back to Europe. The bark's success in reducing fevers stunned the doctors of the day and marked a significant advancement in the treatment of disease. Curious, thought doctors at the time, that there are other, better ways of curing a patient that don't rely on the medieval practices of letting a patient's blood or drilling a hole in their skull. Even though the bark worked, its use as a treatment was not universal. The bark's effectiveness varied wildly depending on the species of Cinchona tree that was sourced, and it cost an arm and leg to ship it over from Peru. Ties to Catholicism during a period of religious bigotry in Europe tainted Cinchona's reputation. English Civil War victor Oliver Cromwell, a famously puritanical Protestant, refused the bark whilst dying from malaria, dismissing it as popish quackery. The Jesuits' bark was for Catholics and the wealthy, and especially wealthy Catholics. At the same time the Cinchona tree was discovered in the New World in the 1630s, Europe's nefarious exploitation of Africa was just beginning. But fast forward 250 years, and Europe's colonial ambitions were not going well. In Europe, Africa was known as the Dark Continent. Dark because, well, Europeans really were in the dark when it came to Africa. They'd only really explored the coast. Anyone with an ego big enough to head inland would usually wind up dead. But within just 40 years, almost the entire continent was colonized by European powers in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. So, what changed? Rapid industrialization of European economies meant these nations were hungry for raw materials, and Africa had them all: timber, gold, palm oil, and coal. You name it, and Europe wanted it, and they were prepared to do anything to get it. There were just a couple of hurdles to overcome. Malaria was a big one. At this point in the 19th century, malaria remained a problem in some parts of Europe, but the strain of malaria found in Africa, falciparum, was far more deadly than the type seen in Europe, especially for those who hadn't built up an immunity from childhood. Death rates among early European explorers were spectacular. During one expedition in 1777 to Mozambique, 132 out of 152 Europeans died from the disease before they returned. Malaria was a blood-sucking spanner in the works for Europe's imperial projects. How could they even work out what was there to take if all their prospectors kept dying in the field? Back to Europe, it's 1820, and French chemists Cavento and Pellier had identified the active ingredient in the Cinchona bark. It was a complex, bitter-tasting chemical they named quinine. Soon, pure quinine salts extracted from the bark allowed for improved forms of anti-malarial treatments. But people continued to suffer from malaria, and those who contracted the disease tended to have recurrent bouts of fever for the rest of their lives. Something had to change. By 1848, an aspiring British medic, Dr. H.R. Thompson, wanted to test out a theory that he'd been mulling over. Instead of taking quinine when the malarial shivering began, Thompson predicted that by taking it daily, a patient could saturate their blood with quinine, killing off any chances of the malaria parasite from taking hold on the body. On an expedition up the Gambia that same year, Thompson got the opportunity to test his theory of quinine prophylaxis on his crew. On their return, Thompson was elated to declare not a single member of the crew succumbed to malaria. Soon after, the British Army were all ears, and by 1848, the British were using it en masse to keep its soldiers and bureaucrats alive long enough to penetrate and carve up Africa, India, and other tropical regions where malaria was rife. On the recommendations of Dr. Thompson and the Army, quinine tablets were to be taken daily, but the ferociously bitter pill was hard to stomach, and so the challenge was to find a more palatable means of taking it. In typical boozy British fashion, it was mixed with sugar, water, and gin. The gin and tonic was born, and it soon became synonymous with colonial life. European leaders saw it as a critical tool in their quest for global dominance. As Churchill put it, the gin and tonic has saved more Englishmen's lives and minds than all the doctors in the empire. Let us not forget that empire was above all else a project to maximize the extraction of resources from colonies to their colonizers. Over 10 million Congolese died in enforced concentration camps producing rubber in the Belgian occupation of the Congo. Millions died from famine in India in the 1870s as farmers were forced to grow export crops that they were unable to feed local peoples. All rail, road, and other infrastructure that was developed and is still to this day used to show empire's benevolent side were in reality designed to get materials from their source to the nearest port, not for the kinds of intercity travel that are helpful to a country's development. The G&T emboldened the British, but at the cost of the lives and minds of the indigenous populations they were repressing. Nevertheless, the colonial cocktail was not enough to keep the British Empire alive. The resistance and bravery of independence movements within colonized regions eventually brought about the decline of this dark chapter in history. These days, more effective and less toxic anti-malarial drugs are used to treat and prevent malaria, but the thirst for the bitter taste of quinine remains. So next time you sip on a G&T, take a moment to wonder at that Peruvian bark, those Jesuit priests, and the bitter legacy of empire infused in this epochal cocktail.